When Amin came to power, Radio Uganda was just opening up new broadcasting towers in the medium wave frequencies, which allowed him to reach far distant corners of his country and indeed other parts of the world through the broadcasting service in Kampala. So what radio did was to shorten the distance between the capital and the periphery, cut out intermediaries of all kinds, and oblige everybody, regardless of where they were, to pay attention and to follow the directives that were being issued in a rapid-fire sequence from Kampala. In that sense, radio worked, as you mentioned, much like Twitter did in Trump's first government. That is, just as in recent American history, this new communications technology allowed an American president to sideline executives and to issue directives about specific aspects of governance, so too in the 1970s in Uganda did Amin use radio broadcasts to direct specific officials out in the provinces to pursue particular paths of action in public life.
This is Rhyming Chaos, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval, tyranny, or authoritarian takeover. We hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now. Today, I'm really happy to be speaking to Derek Peterson, professor in the History Department and the Department of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan, and the author of many, many books and articles on Africa and East Africa in particular, including, most recently, a popular history of Idi Amin's Uganda. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Derek.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me here.
Can we start with a brief biography of Idi Amin? Who was he and how did he come to power?
Well, who Idi Amin was itself the subject of much propagandistic, self-serving, self-inflationary storytelling in the 1970s. He claimed to have been born to a mother who was a healer who had attended the hereditary king of Uganda's most important kingdom, that is Buganda, right in the center of the contemporary country of Uganda. He claimed his mother was a healer who had successfully healed that king's ruler, and that he at various times claimed to have been the child of, in fact, Uganda's king. In fact, he was the son of a policeman. He was, it seems, born in a military barracks in Kampala at a place called Bombo. His father was in and out of the police services and served in the military. Amin enlisted when he was a teenager in the King's African Rifles, as it then was, which later became the Uganda Army. Learned to speak what was called Ki-Kar, the King's African Rifles version of Kiswahili. Served, it's said, in Kenya, fighting against Mau Mau insurgents, and at the time of Ugandan independence became one of two Africans, that is, Black Ugandans, who were made commissioned officers. He was made second lieutenant right before Ugandan independence. It was the British Army's effort to diversify the officer corps and to give the Uganda Army a Ugandan face in its leadership. In the ensuing years, he rose up to positions of importance in public life. He was, within a few years, the commander of one of the two battalions of the Uganda Army. He played a key role in 1966 when the president of Uganda, his name was Milton Obote, sent the army to crush the palace of the hereditary kingdom that I mentioned earlier, the Kingdom of Uganda. As Obote tried to consolidate power in his own hands, Milton Obote, that is, Idi Amin, became his essential instrument, a kind of necessary auxiliary of an increasingly unstable and unpopular government. And in 1971, General Amin, as he then was, overthrew the sitting president, and on the 25th of January brought in the Second Republic of Uganda. She led until he was deposed in April 1979.
That's a lot to take in. And when he did the coup, was there an ideological motivation behind it? Was it just a lust to power, or was there a sort of ideological framework that went with it?
Yeah. In 1971, Amin was not really driven by ideology per se. Later, he would be. By 1972, his would be a government that was organized around a revolutionary ideology. But when he came to power in 71, he was a kind of, what's the right way to put it? He saw himself as the essential figure in Uganda's public life. He knew that Milton Obote was unpopular. As I mentioned, Obote had used the army to crush the hereditary kingdom of Uganda, and in so doing had earned the enmity of a great many educated, civilized, as they saw themselves, upwardly mobile Ugandans. So in the last years of his government, the Obote regime was hugely unpopular, resting on a very unstable foundation. And Amin, recognizing the opportunity, seized power in part because he wished to consolidate his own position. He was not sure that President Obote was going to keep him in his chair as commander of the Uganda army. But he was also driven by kind of the tides of time. By 71, the Obote government was unpopular enough that if Amin had not organized a coup, there probably would have been any number of others who would have stepped up to have overthrown Milton Obote by that time.
How much can we attribute Idi Amin's personality to his successful coup and to the way he ruled? Because he is somebody who has a rather extraordinary charisma, and he's one of the few African dictators of his era that seems to have documented a lot of his life, or have allowed his life to be documented so we can see it. How much was that personality a factor in his rise to power?
He undoubtedly saw himself as a man of destiny. He told journalists on a number of occasions that he'd foreseen the date of his death, that he knew how he was going to die, that he had dreams directing him toward particular policy positions, which seemed sometimes quite irrational or counterproductive. There was a kind of charismatic underpinning to his own self-understanding of who he was in history. By 72, he had convinced himself that he was at the forefront of an unlikely revolution being fought in Uganda against the sort of lingering economic and cultural legacies of colonialism. And that sense of historic destiny vitally shaped his own positions in public policy. As a man of destiny, by 72, he had come to see himself as the leader of a Black revolution that was going to have global consequences for the liberation of colonized people everywhere. You know, his mother may have imparted this to him, his mother a healer, a visionary perhaps, but plainly Amin was in some way sui generis. He governed, you asked about his biography and its role in his regime. He governed as if he were commanding a military battalion. So he'd come up through the ranks, as I mentioned. The King's African Rifles was the schoolhouse that he knew. He had been to Quran school as a youth, but as far as I've listened, we've digitized sound recordings made in the 1970s. His Arabic was very poor. He spoke Swahili haltingly, but it was the language in which he gave most of his public addresses. He went to Quran school, but he didn't learn proper Arabic. And he spoke Luganda, the language of about 30% of Ugandans, with some degree of fluency. So he governed Uganda as if it were a kind of military encampment, using the technologies of his time to kind of issue directives to specific categories of people who he seems to have seen as kind of subordinate officers. The King's African Rifles, its kind of culture of command, its language, were the instruments by which his regime worked.
In your book, you look quite extensively at radio, which was the communications technology of the time, sort of the equivalent of Donald Trump's Twitter or Truth Social account. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of radio in Idi Amin's government?
Yeah. So I make the observation that a dictatorship of any kind relies on a communication technology to work. Dictatorship, derived from the phrase to dictate, demands talking, demands communication if it's to be an effective mode of governance. So for Amin, radio, which was a new technology in his time, radio was the essential prop for his government. There's a chapter in the book that's about radio as a kind of vehicle for dictatorial governance, in which I observed that more or less by accident, Idi Amin inherited in 1971 Africa's most advanced radio broadcasting service. As I mentioned, his predecessor had been unpopular. The predecessor had put in place a program of radio expansion, making, as he hoped, his own presidential voice to be audible over the whole of Uganda. When Amin came to power, Radio Uganda was just opening up new broadcasting towers in the medium wave frequencies, which allowed him to reach far distant corners of his country and indeed other parts of the world through the broadcasting service in Kampala. So what radio did was to shorten the distance between the capital and the periphery, cut out intermediaries of all kinds, and oblige everybody, regardless of where they were, to pay attention and to follow the directives that were being issued in a rapid-fire sequence from Kampala. In that sense, radio worked, as you mentioned, much like Twitter did in Trump's first government. That is, just as in recent American history, this new communications technology allowed an American president to sideline executives and to issue directives about specific aspects of governance, so too in the 1970s in Uganda did Amin use radio broadcasts to direct specific officials out in the provinces to pursue particular paths of action in public life. Build that bridge, clean up that roadway. This was the kind of level of detail that the Amin government, that Amin himself in particular, deployed as an instrument of keeping an eye on what was happening out in the provinces and projecting his will to the far corners of his country.
You also write about, I think at one point you describe it as a do-it-yourself government of self-interested people who develop proprietary feeling of responsibility over matters that are far distant from their own fields of knowledge. Can you explain that a little bit? Because that is another thing that seems to resonate with me when thinking about the current moment in the United States.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. So, as I mentioned, the Amin government dictated through the radio service, but it did not provide the kind of infrastructures or technologies or materials or funding or petroleum that was necessarily to actually bring about the policies that were announced from the center. So while the infrastructure of communication was greatly expanded in the 1970s, the state's capacity to actually deliver on directives given from the center was starkly limited. In Uganda, as in the rest of the world, the 1970s were a time of economic disaster. Concrete, petroleum, all kinds of things were in short supply. Government was trying vainly to control the economy, but even so, the essential commodities by which governance worked, file folders, paper, typewriters, all of that was in short supply. So while local government officials found themselves directed to act in very specific ways via the radio service, they were very rarely given the sort of provisions they needed to follow those directives as they were given. So, as I say in the book, much of governance in the 70s relied on the kind of do-it-yourself stick-to-itiveness of men and women out in the provinces who used their own finances and who relied on unprofessional, uncredentialed allies to make stuff happen in government life. So one of the curious parts of public life in the 1970s is that even though a great many people knew that Amin's government was violent, even though it was a dictatorship, nonetheless, a great number of people sacrificed their time, their energy, and their blood to make government institutions work to pursue the objectives, the kind of high ideals that the Amin government set out. It's that stick-to-itiveness, that sense of proprietary responsibility that I think may also guide politics here in the States today among some parts of the right. That is, this sense of entitlement to the management of civic institutions that had previously been run by credentialed experts. Now, here, as in the 1970s, folks with relatively less credentials feel entitled to take on governmental questions that had previously been closed to them.
That really does feel very resonant with what we see today. The other thing that struck me about your book that made me think of Trump's America is the economic war. I mean, there's quite a lot to understand about this, but what was Idi Amin's economic war? And how did the demonization of Indian Ugandans, how important was that in the economic war?
The economic war was launched as it was called the War of Economic Independence, as it first was, launched in August 1972. It involved the summary expulsion of around 50,000 Asians, as they were called, that is, people of Pakistani and Indian descent who had settled in Uganda in the earlier parts of the 20th century or in the 19th century. By the 1970s, the Asian community was well established, a critical part, in fact, a predominant part of Uganda's economy, especially in the commercial sector, but most of Uganda's doctors, Many of its engineers, its surveyors, its clerks were of South Asian descent. So in August 1972, President Amin determined, as he saw it, to liberate Uganda's economy and public life from outsiders' control, gave that Asian community 3 months to pack up their possessions and leave the country. Most of the folks who he'd addressed with this directive had never been in South Asia. They'd been born in East Africa. There was a multi-generational history that underlay the Asian community. But nonetheless, very quickly, a whole pile of people with many of them with high educational attainments, although not all of them. There were many poor and poorly educated Asians too, who had to find new homes. It was one of the world's first major refugee crises, covered widely in the press, and it was the thing that earned Idi Amin notoriety. It was the first time that he kind of appeared on the television screens of the United States and in Europe as a kind of, all of his irrationality and his brutality paraded before Western and European audiences. Within Uganda, though, the Asian expulsion was hugely popular. There's a long history of anti-Asian organizing in Uganda's public life, as I describe in the book. So President Amin was pulling on that thread of anti-immigrant, anti-Asian sentiment in order to valorize his own role as liberator of Black Ugandans from foreign oppressors. Many of the South Asians who he expelled had taken British Commonwealth citizenship after the independence of India and Pakistan in the 1940s. So they held passports that entitled them to kind of second-class citizenship within the British polity. They couldn't legally travel to and from England, but Amin, nonetheless, in 72, regarded them as a kind of foreign leftover, that is, by the departed British colonial state, who had to be dealt with in order to achieve the second liberation of the country. In the ensuing months and years, Ugandans took over the proprietorship of businesses that Ugandan Asians had vacated, and there was a whole years-long effort to uplift Black economic opportunity, to bring Black Ugandans at the center of the economy. Some of it was successful. Much of it was inspiring. A lot of it was calamitous for economic opportunity and growth. But nonetheless, it was a hugely popular policy initiative driven by a sort of form of popular demagoguery that Amin built upon as he developed this policy. As I describe in the book, the economic war itself is one thing. It was inhumane to a great many South Asians, but almost no South Asians were killed. This was not an experiment with bloody autocracy. They were ushered out of the country, deprived of their possessions, but they were not harassed. There's maybe one Ugandan Asian who lost his life. We're not actually sure that he did lose his life, but virtually every one of those 50,000 people, even if they endured some degree of harassment, even if they were deprived of their social and cultural lives, did not, in fact, spill blood over their expulsion. It was Black Ugandans who suffered. So one of the follow-ons of the expulsion of the Asians was that in the later 70s, Amin set up a whole program of draconian economic rules to regulate the price of commodities on the market, to regulate the exchange of scarce goods, and a great many people who fell afoul of these economic rules were subject to draconian punishments handed down by what was called the Economic Crimes Tribunal, which was a military tribunal that tried smugglers and hoarders and others who fell afoul of the economic rules. The punishment of conviction was death, and it seems from the record that a great many people died before firing squads because they'd overcharged for, the purchase of some small commodity in their shops, or because they'd tried to make a buck by smuggling a sack of hose across the border, something like that. It's that aspect of the economic history of the 70s that's where Amin's government was at its most brutal and its most inhumane, not really in the expulsion of the Asians.
The expulsion of the Asians, it was done bloodlessly. It was the follow-up after that, where Black African Ugandans were punished for perceived economic crimes, was where the brutality lay.
That's right. I know and value my acquaintance with a number of Ugandan Asians. There's a whole community of 5,000 who ended up in Toronto, just across the border from where I am now in Michigan. Many of them ended up in the United Kingdom. A few hundred ended up in the United States, where they settled in Spartanburg, South Carolina.
And in New York City, one of the progenies could become the next mayor of New York City, right?
That's right. One of the many South Asians who were expelled included the father of the current Democratic nominee for New York City mayor, Zohran Mamdani, whose father is a prominent academician and colleague and mentor of mine, in fact.
And he has, in fact, written with a degree of sympathy about the expulsion of the Asians. I just read one paper, I think it was, where he looks at, I think, the rationale for it and has some sympathy for the reasons behind it. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, I don't know if he has sympathy so much as he has understanding of Amin's political program. He calls Amin, I think rightly, the father of a Ugandan nation, a Black Ugandan nation, which is how Amin saw himself. He regarded himself as the champion of the oppressed Black majority. Whether in Uganda or in other parts of the world, he put Uganda at the center of global history. And it's that aspect of his political ideology that Professor Mamdani, that is the father of the New York City governor, writes about and is impressed with as part of Amin's political program. It's a contrast with the current government of Uganda's view of public life that we can talk about at some length if you want.
Perhaps we can do that right now. How has the legacy of Idi Amin affected later governments of Uganda, and how do you look at the current government of Uganda?
Look, as I've mentioned, Amin, after 1972, cast himself as liberator of Uganda's oppressed Black majority. This was hugely inspiring for a great many people. So the latter part of my book is about Ugandans who were inspired by Amin's vision of politics and who sacrificed themselves to build civic institutions. So there's a chapter about a man who funded the building of a museum and a monument. There's another chapter about a person, an unremarkable person who put himself at the center of the global history of Pan-Africanism. The 70s were a kind of time of political experimentation for a great many Ugandans, in which global possibilities seemed to be right on their doorstep. That was the achievement of the 1970s in Uganda, that Amin was able to transform Uganda's public life such that for some Ugandans, a whole field of consequential patriotic work seemed to open up. And that was the source of their willingness to sacrifice their time and their treasure. That is, this feeling of destiny that suddenly now a whole field of patriotic self-sacrifice lay open before them as an opportunity to make history, to transform the world. We can do this right here in Uganda. We're leading a global struggle. That idea was hugely inspiring for many people, and it drove both their patriotism and their demagoguery in ways that I can describe if you like. Today, the energy of the 1970s is a distant memory. There are very few Ugandans who feel themselves engaged in some globally consequential work. Instead, so the current government of Uganda came to power in 1986. Its leader, Yoweri Museveni, was a student radical who had fought against Amin in the 1970s, who came to power in 1986, having taken over from the discredited government of his predecessors, and who cast himself as the author of a revolution that had utterly transformed Uganda's public life. For a time, for a few years, the National Resistance Movement, as it was called, set about trying to build civic institutions that promoted democracy and participation. But by the early 90s, Museveni and his government had kind of run out of revolutionary energy. So they made a deal with the monarchists, that is, the men who had been the architects of these ancestral kingdoms that I've mentioned a few times. In 1993, Museveni agreed to restore Uganda's kingdoms to their places of power. 4 of them at first. Now there are probably a dozen kingdoms that have been recognized in one way or the other under Ugandan law. In so doing, he handed over matters of jurisprudence and cultural policy to the management of these kings, who govern on the behalf of kind of ancestral tradition, who govern on behalf of misogynistic, patriarchal conceptions of legal practice, who have very definite ideas about what appropriate morality looks like, who are in some ways the backbone of Uganda's moral conservatism, its aversion to sexual minorities. It's that turn toward conservatism that's a disappointment for many folks, and that really has sapped as I've said, the kind of idealism out of public life. Today, Museveni, as I've written about in a public opinion piece, Museveni is riding on the coattails of the memory of his 1986 revolution. It's not clear that the energy of that revolutionary moment can continue to fuel his regime, but he's standing for president again in January next year, in part on the memory of what happened in 1986.
And how does Bobby Wine play into this? Because he seems to be somebody who has charisma and political energy.
He is. So it's worth saying that the vast majority of Ugandans have been born since 1986. The demographic fact is that very few people have the memory now of the violence of the Amin government or of the politically unstable regimes that followed his from 1979 to 1986. So the darkness of the old era is no longer the omnipresent fact that can cover up the sins of Museveni's government today. Bobi Wine represents a young generation of Kampala residents, young men and women who are disenfranchised from the current setup, who don't see much possibilities for advancement within the kind of baronial politics of Uganda today, and who are willing to tear it all down and start over again. He is a charismatic figure. He doesn't really have a plan to govern Uganda, but nonetheless, he's popular among folks who think that the system has no particular benefit for them and that they may as well just start over again with someone like Bobi Wine, who has very little political or administrative experience.
But has energy.
That's right.
Can we go back to the personality of Idi Amin? Because it's striking. I mean, both reading your book and I guess quite a lot of my memory is informed by the film Idi Amin, A Self-Portrait.
A film that more folks ought to watch, actually. It's a brilliant piece of kind of avant-garde cinema for its time.
It's absolutely amazing. I find it very difficult to avoid comparing the personality of Idi Amin with Trump in a number of different ways. The continual need to lecture experts on their own field, the sense of the pomposity, the sense of the self-aggrandizement. How do you feel, as somebody who probably knows Idi Amin as well as almost any other living scholar, looking at Trump, I mean, how do you see the similarities? Do you feel the same as I do? Talk about that.
Yeah. Maybe I'll start by talking about film. So the film we were talking about earlier, Idi Amin, A Self-Portrait, was made by the Belgian-Swiss filmmaker, Barbet Schrader. It was basically Schrader turned on his camera and let Amin direct the scenes. So Amin is omnipresent, telling Schrader to shoot that shot, to shoot the other shot. There's a voiceover that Schrader gives, but largely it's Amin who directs the whole thing. That film was made shortly after the Asian expulsion, at the same time that Amin's government was making a different film that I recently unearthed in the cinematic archives of the Uganda Broadcasting Corporation. It's called The Economic War. It's a 27-minute film made by the Uganda Film Unit to uplift Idi Amin's accomplishments as the president of the Second Republic. And what it is a form of propaganda making the expulsion of the Asians appear to be a revolutionary act. So while Amin was directing Barbet Schrader's camera, at the same time, he also had state broadcasting cameras there taking pictures of him leading rallies, trying to inspire Ugandans around this sense of historical purpose, around claiming the heights of the economy for themselves. That film is a remarkable piece created by a Kenyan filmmaker who was working for the Uganda Film Unit, who had been trained in Poland at the famous Lodz Film School, which was a film school that trained a great many Eastern European socialist filmmakers. And it used the techniques of socialist filmmaking to celebrate the kind of Ugandan man on the street who had been advantaged by Amin's revolutionary behavior. There are no voices other than that of the narrator. His name was Gamba. Amin himself never speaks. Instead, what we get are studio-produced music with a British marching band and with Gamba describing the enthusiasm of all the Ugandans who were inspired by Amin's regime. This film was screened widely within Uganda and was sent to foreign embassies as a means of influencing foreign appraisals of the expulsion of the Asian community. It was a story that was at the bottom, really, of Idi Amin's popularity in, for example, among Black American activists who regarded him as a champion of Black liberation, not just for Uganda, but for the United States as well. We can come back to that if you want. Anyway, that kind of propaganda in which a kind of feeling of unanimity could be generated out of the cinematic tricks that Sao Gamba, the filmmaker, had used to create an impression of consensus. That kind of media-driven sense of unanimity is as much part of our own time and place as it is in the 1970s. Just, social media today is increasingly, it seems, driven by algorithms that make one feel as though you're living within an echo chamber. It's very hard to break out of it. And likewise, the experience of living in the 1970s in Uganda, listening to official media, will have been like being on Truth Social, I think. That is very hard to get a hold of facts or political views that are at distance from the official line, playing up a sense of grievance, driving opinion by heightening, a feeling of historical destiny and purpose among folks who wanted to seize the moment and make their mark upon their country at that moment in time. The media economy of the 70s and the media economy of our own time are together creating the kind of conditions for a popular demagoguery that shapes our public life here. A demagoguery based on the targeting of foreigners, on kind of blaming immigrants for the failings of our own public society. I haven't answered your question about personalities, but I do think that the media infrastructures produce in both the 70s in Uganda and in our own time a feeling of consensus around politically objectionable positions that ought not really be majority views.
You haven't really talked about the personality, but what you've said is that the media environment has allowed personality like Trump or in the 70s, Idi Amin in Uganda, to sort of take over the brains of thinking people who might otherwise not find acceptable what they're promoting.
That's right. Yeah. Another kind of aspect of this for the work I've done on Uganda is the photographic archive. We've digitized 50,000 medium format still photographs that were made by the Uganda government's photographic unit, who were following around Idi Amin, taking photographs of official functions and of private life. These are beautiful pictures. The medium format black and white picture are so, once they're scanned, they're so detailed that you can pick up tiny little details on these pictures. They were made with the intention of creating this sense of unanimity that I was just talking about, this sense of shared enthusiasm. So there are no pictures that show disdainful or bored or disinterested people. There are no pictures of Amin chewing with his mouth open or sweating or standing askew or tugging at his uniform or whatever. There's 50,000 pictures that we've scanned, but there must have been hundreds of thousands of pictures that the photographers discarded as they came out of the chemical baths because they were uncomplimentary, because they deprived the picture of its power to persuade. So what's left is this massive collection of pictures that are meant to create an impression of consensus and shared identity and purpose among Ugandans. This, too, was an aspect of the media infrastructure of the kind of echo chamber that I've talked about, in which, as you put it, thinking Ugandans with their own purposes could be persuaded that they were part of a mass movement that was together enthusiastically pursuing the objectives for liberation that the Amin government had set out.
And it's curious because I think one of the interesting features of your book is the sense you get of the willing participation of Ugandans in Idi Amin's government, and very enthusiastic sometimes. But you also get the sense of fear. Again, it sort of makes me wonder about the current environment in the United States, where it's difficult to know, is it fear or is it attraction for this leader that is driving much of the behavior?
As you will gather, the book is not really a rehabilitation of the person and the politics of Idi Amin, but it does try to render intelligible aspects of his government in a way that not all Ugandans will appreciate or will share. A great many people did suffer and die in those years. Violence was an inescapable fact of life. So was fear, particularly in the southern part of the country and also in Lira, the part of Uganda from which the previous president, Milton Obote, had come. Thousands of people died. in the hands of agents of state who were empowered by President Amin to act as petty dictators simply because they had on army uniforms and acted as a kind of instrument of his government. The army was delegated to handle all kinds of civic affairs, greatly to the advantage of local democracy, greatly to the disadvantage of the rights of folks who were outside the military administration. So again, I want to be careful to say that not everyone was inspired, not everyone was drawn into this kind of enthusiasm that I've been trying to explain. I have a chapter in the book about the history of violence, not because I think it only deserves a chapter, but because I want to explain the pervasiveness of violence analytically. And it's not so much, as I say in the chapter, that I think all Ugandans were terrified, as much as it is that I think many folks were simply indignant. In Uganda, as in many other places, there's a kind of cultural divide between South and North. The North in Uganda is a place, particularly the Northwest, where Idi Amin came from, is linguistically, ethnically, politically, culturally quite distant from the South. There are not many schools. There were not many schools in the 70s. People spoke Swahili, not the cultured languages of people in the South. In the South, people had been educated in schools for generations. They were Christians. They'd been habituated into the kind of polite life of colonial society. After independence, it was them who ran the bureaucracy. When Amin came to power in 71, all the northern barbarians, Swahili speakers with big guns in their hands, were empowered because they were the men in the army to dictate to Southerners about matters of importance in public life. And it's that feeling of, what do we call it, indignation, that these uncivilized barbarians from the North are telling us what to do. It's that feeling of indignation that created sort of a sense of pervasive insecurity, especially in Kampala and in the very populous southern parts of the country. And it's those folks who commanded the exile politics of their time. They went educated with money, literate in English. It's they who were the informants for journalists. It's they who set up exile communities in Dar es Salaam and London and New York and Nairobi. It's they who kind of created an image of Idi Amin, the flesh-eating barbarian, that was to be pervasive in public life right through the fall of his government in 79. So to answer your question, it's not only fear, it's a kind of culturally conditioned, geographically and historically formed sense of, what do we call it, of loss of initiative, particularly for Southerners, that created the conditions for this sense of insecurity.
Does that have any resonance for you with our current moment in the United States?
It's not quite like that, but certainly, looking out on this from the University of Michigan, one of America's great public universities, we have a bunch of know-nothings running things in Washington, from Kennedy's yesterday, for example, withdrew funding for mRNA vaccine research. These should not be controversial things. They want to wind up the education department as though we've had enough education. Particularly for those of us who are intellectuals, it looks to us as though folks, they're withdrawing funding from the agencies that all of us rely on to advance essential medical research, to advance scientific knowledge. They're winding up funding for the NEH, or they're redeploying it. All this, it's not quite like the 70s in Uganda. I don't want to go there, but the anti-intellectual, anti-expertise aspects of the 70s in Uganda do remind me of the moment in which I sit here as a public intellectual at one of America's great public universities.
And may I ask, how are things at the University of Michigan? I mean, what is the mood on campus?
Perilous. It happens I've just got elected as the chair of faculty government here at U of M, which is a big job. It's 7,000 of us who are faculty members or clinical professors at this university. And, it happens that I've written in part about academic life and conditions of constraint in times of austerity and times of political challenge. I've inspired by the example of colleagues at Makerere University in Kampala, who during the 1970s, for a time at least, managed to carry on their research and create kind of politically useful, critical scholarship in a time of great political upset. Here, I don't know that we're destined to live through the political tumult of the 70s. I hope that we're not. But here, as in Makedide, funding for critical research is short. There's a foreshortening of the space for free speech. Criticism of the state of Israel is very difficult to articulate, even at a university where free speech is supposed to be valued. The university administration is clamping down on protesters who in a former time would have been valued as participants in our university's distinguished tradition of dissenting politics. Now, a very paranoid administration is trying to keep these protesters off campus, greatly to the disadvantage of these students' First Amendment rights. So again, it's not as though I feel like I'm living through the times that I've written about in Uganda, but there are disturbing parallels. As leader of faculty government, I think, well, what are the costs if I say this in public? With what consequence? What will happen to myself? What will happen to the colleagues who I'm trying to advocate for? And it's that feeling of being guarded that I'm most worried about. I should not have to feel that way in my advocacy.
Absolutely. So do you think we can learn anything from Idi Amin's Uganda that is applicable to political and intellectual lives in the United States right now?
The last chapter in the book that I've written is about an unlikely movement. They're called the Rwenzururu, who was led by unlettered people living on the mountains between Congo, Zaire as it then was, and Uganda, a very remote part of the country, of the world really, hard to get to from either side of the border. In the early 60s, these mountaineers set out to establish an independent kingdom, living as they did between two dysfunctional governments, two dysfunctional states. They created their own kingdom with their own king, with their own government ministries, with their own schools, trying to use their own language, Lukonzo as it is called, and with their own media infrastructure, relying largely on the circulation of inspirational letters written by their king, which were read out to remote assemblies of people in the mountains who came together to listen to what their king had to say to them. When in the 1970s Amin came to power, this dissident kingdom in this remote place was to become the only group of people within Uganda's borders who held out and defended a community that was in some sense free of Idi Amin's dictatorship. There were lots of critics. There were lots of dissidents from Amin's Uganda. Many of them went to live in exile, as I mentioned. But it was the Rwenzururu partisans who stayed in reach of Uganda's army, who conducted a kind of war of liberation that lasted right through the 1970s, and who managed to secure, if not the peace and prosperity, at least the independence of their people for 2 decades, only laying it down in 1982 after Idi Amin left power. That's when the Rwenzururu leadership came down from the mountains and accepted that they were to be citizens of the independent Republic of Uganda. But for 20 years, these partisans managed to hold on to their independence there in the mountains. So in the chapter, I try to describe why it is that these people were successful in their efforts to maintain their cultural, political independence. And it's largely, as I say in the chapter, it's because they lived off the grid. They unplugged themselves from the infrastructures of communication. They developed the capacity to listen critically to Radio Uganda and the pronouncements that Idi Amin was issuing from the capital. They had a kind of catechism, an almost catechistic relationship with their history, by which every school kid learned the foundational elements of their people's struggle against the autocracies of Uganda and Zaire. And that sense of purpose, they're somewhere between a political movement and a cult. And it's that sense of shared identity that secured their freedom. I find them to be inspirational, not because I want to go off and live in the mountains to get free from Idi Amin, or from Donald Trump, rather, but because their habits of mind, the disciplines that they developed, I think can be instructional in our own time and place. A willingness, that is, to listen critically to official media, to find the discipline within oneself, to remember who one is separate from what social media tells oneself, capacity to live in communities that are grounded in historical facts and which are validated by the experience of shared endeavor and shared struggle. Another way of saying what others have sometimes said, and that is we need to find communities that we can invest in these times of travail in public life. But the Banyada Rwenzururu actually did it. And in that sense, I described them in front of Ugandan audiences as among the kind of heroes of Ugandan history. And really, I think that they're example is in some way instructional for us today as we look for paths out of our own dictatorships of the mind in which we live, whether here in the States or in other parts of the world.
Well, Derek, on that note, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. I think there's a lot to learn from your wonderfully informative book that felt as though it gave me a new way of thinking about Uganda that sort of transcended the cliches.
I'm glad it did that. That was what I was trying to do, is kind of, rehabilitate this time in East Africa's history.
Well, I think you succeeded. The Writing Chaos podcast is produced by Maria Repnikova and me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Cadre Script. The theme music is Paperweight, composed and performed on the Gujong by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed also by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Lilian Fei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and take out a paid subscription if you like what we're doing at rhymingchaos.com. Derek, thank you so much.
A real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Jeremy.